Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Artist, starring Jean Dujardin, Bernice Bejo, I don't know if I'm saying that right, please forgive me, James Cromwell, Penelope Ann Miller, Malcolm McDowell, Missy Pyle, Beth Grant, Ed Lauter, Joel Murray, Ked Davidian, and I don't know if I said that right either, please forgive me, and John Goodman, directed by, and this is going to be another hard one to say, Michael Hazenovich. I don't know, something like that. But before I get into this, I saw this movie before it ever won the Best Picture, and I gotta be honest, I walked out of the theater rather unamused. Well, not unamused, but not impressed. But then it won Best Picture. Maybe it takes a second viewing to regain my opinion, but let's see if that still remains true after all these years after winning the Best Picture Oscar. Let's get into it. In 1927, George Valentin, played by Jean Dujardin, is a silent movie actor as he watches one of his films, and after the show is over, he's on top of the world and he's behind the screen, and as the credits roll, he takes the stage with his canine sidekick performing some cute tricks on stage, and the guy seems kind of like a show off when he's on stage with his co-star Constance, played by Missy Pyle, briefly, flips him the bird, and I thought, really, with the finger? And outside the theater, he still acts like a show-off, and he still considers acting like a douche. Particularly when he is bumped by an upcoming actress named Pepe Miller, played by Bernice Bejo. And to be totally honest with you guys, I like the dog, but I'm honestly not sure why this won Best Picture of the year and the Oscars in the year 2012. As this movie is pretty overrated. I mean, it's a good story from going from silent movie to the movies we know today, but my problem is with this movie is I was unfortunately kind of bored with it, but I like the fact it took place in Hollywood in the late 1920s, as I don't like George in this movie at all, as he comes off like a dick. As I'm not sure about the other characters except for John Goodman and James Cromwell, who are character actors I like seeing in other movies. George's director Al Zimmer, played by John Goodman, is upset about Peppy being in the picture, and George randomly dances with her feet as he doesn't know it's Peppy behind the frame, and Al almost fires her, but what George talks him into being in the picture, and I like the chemistry as with James Cromwell and John Goodman. Those two have good chemistry together, even though they're not in the same scenes almost. They barely talk with the words on the screen, as Jean Dujardin did win the Best Actor for this performance in this movie, as he is very good, but I still don't like the character with Bernice Bejo, which I'm gonna just be blunt. I don't like her either in this movie either. Not the actress. I don't know. I don't have a problem with her. Just the character. But after a while, it gets kind of depressing, where the movie goes as it did happen eventually in real life, and if it's a genius, and it is a genius idea to keep it a silent movie for almost the whole movie. But when I first saw this, I was kind of falling asleep right off the bat, which is why I walked out of the theater, as it did bore me. But it took multiple viewings to realize how good of a movie it is, as in my opinion, at the end of the day, this isn't the greatest, but it's an okay movie. It's not a great movie, like people are saying it is, and I personally don't think it should have won Best Picture of the year 2012, in my opinion. Almost reminds me of some people of how The Shape of Water not deserving the Best Picture of the year, but I personally was glad it won Best Picture of 2017. This movie doesn't deserve the win in my opinion, but it did win, so I'm here to review my reasons on why it shouldn't have won, despite Jean Dujardin's acting performance is the best thing about this movie in my opinion, despite I don't like the character. George hears noises like he hears things, as this is supposed to be a silent world, but he hears sounds of the entire world, including his dog barking, and he's the only person in silent mode, and this thing kind of bugged me because how are things making noises and he's not? Which makes sense back in the day, as it was shot in black and white, but if it was shot in color, it wouldn't make much sense. So I'm kind of in two minds on this at this point. Whether I like the movie or not, I'll get there at the end. George visits Al in his office as they talk about the movies are talking now, as it's the future called, oh, let me see if I'm saying this right, Kinograph Studios? And George refuses to believe in that as he walks out of Al's office and tries to make his own great movie as he chats with Peppy as she signed up for Kinograph Studios, and she gives George her number while still married to not Constance but Penelope Ann Miller. What was her name? Doris, thank you. As he writes a script of his own great movie in the silent film industry as it's becoming extinct, as people are led to believe he's a puppet, and his quote as he's an artist, which makes sense for this movie's title. George's wife, Doris, played by Penelope Ann Miller, becomes unhappy as she asks for him for a divorce. Peppy goes to dinner with a couple of guys that are interviewing her, while George overhears them talking about how silent films are disappearing and how it's life. And George is now depressed because he can't find work anymore after the next movie isn't as popular as he wanted it to be, which is rather unfortunate. But like Peppy said, it's life. He needs to get over it. Now, if it were the early 1920s, I would have liked this a little more, but it's the late 20s, so it's depressing more than impressing me. Peppy comes to George's porch and feels bad for him, and she goes home as she wants to be alone as her assistant drives her home. And I'm not feeling her depression as much as I want to because I'm just bored at this point. As this movie is moving pretty fast for a movie that's an hour and 40 minutes, which is good, but the second half didn't really. But it doesn't change my opinion about it by the end of the day. George fires his assistant Clifton, played by James Cromwell, and he's sad about it as he waits for him outside his house to get him into the car, as George doesn't have work. And I'm not crying, I'm more irritated with this movie because it's telling the same boring story, and I think it's going on a little too long for me. George sells his things at the house, as well as maybe not his house, as it depresses Peppy. And this is such a hard movie to watch at this point. I'm not checked out at all. I'm just more irritated and bored at this point because this movie is going on a little too long. George is at a bar when he sees a little character he played on one of his final movies as he's knocked out when drunk. But Clifton picks him up from the bar and brings him home with his dog, which kind of comforted me. The next day, he goes to the cinemas to see Peppy's new picture, and he looked like he enjoyed it and brings him back memories of his own work in Hollywood, which gets an image of his shadow saying he's been stupid, and George destroys the room filled with his own films and burns the films as well as his house, and the dog calls for help for a cop, and the dog is the best performer in the whole movie as he tells the cop George's house is burning as he goes with the dog to the burning house as Peppy sees George is being hospitalized. So she goes to see him at the hospital, and hopefully no Hollywood former star goes through that, as it's depressing life as this movie is getting too depressing. Peppy sees George is still alive, and as he's resting in his bed, as Peppy works on the set, and she considers hiring George back into the movie business with Al, and she convinces Al to bring him back. Meanwhile, Clifton comes back to work for George as Peppy wants to give George a script for her next movie, and George throws it away at first, as the dog wants him to accept this opportunity, and goes in the room where he buried his life, and he goes out with his dog and realizes he wants to go back to the movie business, well, kind of, as he almost commits suicide. And Pepe tries to find George while driving like a maniac, and he stops himself and thinks he'll do the talkie dialogue, but he's not good at that because nobody wants to hear his voice as they tap dance. And Al loves it and films it, and that's when the sound and dialogue start to kick in. And that was a happy ending, but the climax is really depressing me half to death. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 5.3 out of 10. There's some good things here and some bad things in this movie. Starting with the good, I like the dog, Jean Dardine's performance, Bernice Burhill's performance, even though I don't like those two characters, James Cromwell's performance, and John Goodman's performance as the two main characters have good chemistry, and I always enjoy watching James Cromwell and John Goodman, and it does have a happy ending, but by the end of the day, the bad in this movie is it was boring, as it irritated me halfway through. I personally don't think this movie deserves the Best Picture Oscar win, as it was a long film, because the film is mediocre at best, and the plot did bore me half to death. But I was never checked out. I was more depressed as this movie depressed me half to death, because this movie is very just boring, depressing. It shouldn't have won the Best Picture, but it did. But I don't like the characters of the two main characters, but the performances are good though. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and until we get to the next one, really